Pakistan has paid an enormous cost for aiding and abetting actions such as the hijacking. So accountability for the hijacking was never fixed. The government was in an impossible situation. It is well known that those terrorists were referred to themselves by those very nicknames or slang names. That's a matter of historical record.
A major controversy has developed over the last couple of days in the Indian media, particularly with some sections of Indians alleging, first of all, taking issue with the fact that Hindu names were used for some of the hijackers in this series released by Netflix surrounding the hijacking of IC814. Also, questions being raised about the content of the show and in many ways not really mentioning the role of Pakistan and the inter-services intelligence in carrying out this hijacking. So joining us now to comment on the IC814 hijacking more generally, this controversy and how it's changed India over the last 25 years is India's former High Commissioner to Pakistan, TCA Raghavan. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. Could I ask you, just to begin with, your initial thoughts on what you're seeing about this controversy, about this new Netflix series on the IC814 hijacking, questions about Hindu names being used for the hijackers, which although it seems to be historically accurate, and also, there's also criticism from certain sections that the filmmakers have not sort of talked about the role of Pakistan as well as the ISI as much as they should have. Could I ask you to comment on these controversies that seem to be coming up around the series?
Well, I haven't seen the film, so I can't comment on the film itself. But I read about this controversy, and I'm a little surprised because I think this point that the terrorists should not have Hindu names is a bizarre kind of contention, and I think it is well known that those terrorists were referred to themselves by those very nicknames or slang names. That's a matter of historical record. I don't think it should be erased from the record, and I don't think there is any real controversy about this. I think this is it's a bizarre kind of position, with the expectation that the people who will watch this film have an IQ of less than 20 to be swayed by such comments. It is well known that the hijackers were from Pakistan, that Pakistan intelligence had a role to play in it, and that on the whole, that whole episode was a deeply traumatic time for all of us in India. I think all of that is well known. To try to make a controversy over a non-issue, I think really is something most regrettable.
So if I could ask you in terms of, it's been 25 years since the hijacking took place in the last week of December 1999. You were a diplomat in the foreign ministry. You've handled Pakistan very closely. Could I ask you to reflect a little bit on how that hijacking has impacted India, how it impacted Indian diplomacy at that time, and now with 25 years of hindsight, how you think it shaped the course of India-Pakistan relations, India's approach to the Taliban, and just your 25 years of hindsight, as it were?
Well, it was a deeply traumatic period because for about a period of 7 or 8 days, the whole country was in limbo, wondering what was happening. The government was in an impossible situation. In the circumstances, there was very little choice for them to take any other steps than the one they finally took. The steps were deeply regretted, I think, by everyone concerned, that terrorists had to be released, and that too taken to Kandahar to be released. But as I said, there was no other option in the circumstances which prevailed. I've written about it, and I think that Mr. Jaswant Singh, as the External Affairs Minister at that time, took a bullet on behalf of the government, and it's a role for which he has been condemned. But I don't think sufficient cognizance is given to how difficult the situation was at that time. Alongside the hijacking, the entire episode and the way it was handled showed a number of major weaknesses and shortcomings in our own internal security methodologies and procedures. I hope those have strengthened. In terms of the impact it had on India-Pakistan relations, actually the hijacking was an episode which had very little long-term impact. People internalized the trauma, but diplomacy with Pakistan nevertheless continued because not very much, not too long after that, President Musharraf was invited to India for the Agra summit by Prime Minister Vajpayee. And although after that things changed because of the attack on Parliament, nevertheless that process which was started in Agra continued thereafter from 2003 onward. So I would say the hijacking, although it was a deeply traumatic event, did not really have that much impact on India-Pakistan diplomacy, even over a period of 2 or 3 years.
Understood, sir. So could I ask you?
Certainly, there was a certain sentiment in India which remains that accountability for the hijacking was never fixed, and the people who were responsible never really had to pay the cost for this step which they had taken. I think that is true, but it is also true that in a wider sense, Pakistan has paid an enormous cost for aiding and abetting actions such as the hijack. In some senses, they are still sowing the harvest, the seeds for which they had themselves laid. They are still reaping that harvest.
Right, sir.
So in a sense, we can say that although full justice was not done, a certain amount of justice has historically taken place on its own.
So if I could ask you 2 questions specifically. Number one, you said that, given the enormous pressure the government was under, and of course the lives of the over 100 Indian citizens was at risk, that really the government had very little choice. We played the cards we were dealt. But there are some questions, especially today, that have been raised by some commentators on the fact that Omar Sheikh was let go, Masood Azhar, who has then since turned out to be quite a thorn in India's side, masterminding 2001 Parliament attacks, what we saw in Pulwama as well. Lots of questions about was it therefore worth it. So you said this, and commentators have then pointed out that look, Masood Azhar and others like him, those who were released, have really been a persistent thorn in India's side. Your view on this, looking back, was it a mistake?
Everyone regretted the decision to release those terrorists. Nobody was in favor of it, but there was no other way out. And I think the government, in doing so, was acting responsibly. It was taking what it knew was a wrong and difficult decision, but realized that it had to take it. So I think it's easy to criticize. It's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of that particular historical conjuncture. But let us not overlook our own failings. Both Masood Azhar and Omar Sheikh had been in Indian custody for a long period of time before that. But they were never convicted. They were never brought to trial. If they had been convicted criminals, the Pakistani position with regard to them would have been that much more difficult to sustain internationally. But there was this, because of our own internal weaknesses, and especially weaknesses in the way justice is administered, you had some of the terrorists who were released had been in our custody for a long period of time. Why were they never brought to trial and sentenced? Because releasing a sentenced terrorist has a certain international ramification, which was not there in the case of Omar Sheikh and Masood Azhar.
And so if I may ask you just 2 final questions. One on the Taliban side of the equation. The Taliban Of course, a lot has been written about their role. At one time, Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh praised them for their role in in helping the deal go through with the hijackers. But since then, a lot has been written about how the Taliban actually, at that point in time, were playing both sides. Were also trying to make sure the hijackers got what they wanted. Could I ask you to comment on, and of course, at the time in 1999, India didn't really have a relationship with the Taliban. Could I ask you to comment a little bit on looking back 25 years on how that incident impacted India's relationship with the Taliban? Was Taliban useful to India in getting this deal done?
I think the Taliban, or in fact the Afghan view in general, was that they had no choice in the matter. The Taliban says now that, what could we do? The ISI insisted on our taking the steps that we did, and we had no real choice. And frankly, it's now 25 years past. There is no way that issue can be resolved. But yes, there was a certain element of the Taliban trying to play both sides, telling us one thing and acting on behalf of the Pakistanis in another way. I think that duplicity was there, but there is nothing which you can do about it at this stage. And as I said, the hijacking was one episode in a longer history, and thereafter many other developments have taken place. So we have to see it in terms of that wider context.
Understood. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global to explain a little bit of how you see the controversy, how you see the IC814 hijacking 25 years on, adding a little bit of much needed context and insight into the rather heated conversation that has taken over public discourse on this issue over the last couple of days. Thank you so much again, Ambassador, for joining us, and thank you for watching India Today Global.